Morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for being here.
Happy to be here. Are
thanks
other people here, or is it just
Other
us?
people will be here. Other people will be here.
Okay.
So I'll just say thanks everybody for tuning in this morning to listen to our first episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. We'll be talking with Reverend Dr. Jennifer Ayres this morning about all things ecology, theology, environmental justice, and obviously with the backdrop of COVID-19. These conversations will be casual, coffee style, and hopefully glean some insights about how we should live in the world connected to both God and creation. So with me this morning, as I said, is Dr. Jennifer Ayres from Candler School of Theology, and I will turn it over to her to introduce herself and then open us with a reading.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you for inviting me for this conversation. Although I was under the impression, based on the name of this conversation, that there would be some sort of virtual bartending happening.
Yeah, mimosas should have been a part of it, probably.
It is 10 a.m. after all. I'm really glad to be with you all. I've been a long admirer of the work of Gipple and am delighted that two Candler alums, Whitney and Cody, are now working for that wonderful organization. I'll say a little bit more about, well, I guess, Cody, is now a good time to say how I got into this conversation?
Absolutely.
Okay,
absolutely.
Great. So I actually am not, from my beginning, an environmental theology scholar. I sort of came into this conversation sort of sideways from my original work with theologies of social justice. And I wrote a book called Good Food, which was primarily an exploration of people and communities of faith who were engaged in the work for food justice. And so my first questions about that had to do with food access and nutrition and economics. And I only barely scratched the surface of the environmental dimensions of that project. And so, but that work, that initial taste really piqued my interest and my passion. And so since that book came out in 2013, I've really been focusing on that ecological dimension of the work. So I'm sort of a newbie in some ways to the conversation. And I live with my spouse and our two kids in Avondale Estates, where we try to grow some food, sometimes successfully and sometimes not so successfully. But anyway, it's a really nice chance to talk with you and with other folks who care about this conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Your setting sounds like at least nature is with you this morning.
Is it too loud? Should I put some?
No, it's perfect. That's great.
Okay. Yeah, the birds have been, yeah, I think they're having some sort of protest about the lockdown. Or maybe it's probably more of a celebration.
Yeah, they're probably having a great time.
Yeah, they're having a great time. And now there's a siren coming. I was telling Cody earlier that my spouse this morning has a couple of important meetings, and so he's in the dedicated office space, and so I'm in the mobile office, which means I'm outside or at the dining room table. I hope I'll be able to stay out here, but if that's not too distracting.
This is perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to begin with a poem that many of you probably already know, and it's one that I turn to again and again when I think about what it means to live as a person of faith or a person of conscience in the world today. And it's by Mary Oliver. It's called The Summer Day. And when I was reading it again this morning, I was thinking it has new relevance given the time that we're living in now. The summer day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out on the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, one who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? That's Mary Oliver.
Such a good one.
It is a good one.
So what for you drew you to that piece for this morning, other than it being a just beautiful poem?
Yeah, well, couple of things. One is that I'm a Presbyterian minister, and I'm a theological educator, and yet I sometimes find it difficult to pray. I don't know exactly what it is that is happening when I pray. And Mary Oliver's reframing of prayer as paying attention for me is really helpful, and has fed my spiritual life in that it invites me to be present, to attend to everything that my senses are telling me about the world in which I'm praying, my immediate experience of it. And so I find that helpful in every season. In our current situation, I also think that maybe I'm alone in this, but I think that the crisis that we're facing, the health crisis, the economic crisis, and the vulnerability that that introduces into all of our lives, also is an invitation to think about how we most deeply want to spend our lives. And the vulnerability of human life is so apparent in this crisis. And so I do think it raises the question that Oliver raises, what it is that we plan to do with our one wild and precious life. Yeah. And so for me, this poem has new poignancy.
Yeah, paying attention, I think, is definitely a theme that shows up so much in both conversations about environmental justice and being present, but also in your own work, and several of your articles and books, that sort of theme of paying attention and being grounded. Mm-hmm. Before we move to that, I wanted to at least ask some questions. You mentioned a bit about being a Presbyterian minister and an educator. So I wanted to ask, how does being a Presbyterian, and specifically a Presbyterian minister, further shape the way that you think about some of these themes? Are there particular tools within that tradition that you feel like ground your thoughts about theology and environment?
Yeah. The Reformed tradition has a long history of engaging the political sphere. That was sort of a part of why John Calvin wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion. He was trying to speak to a state context in which the reformers were being persecuted. And so that's sort of in our DNA as Presbyterians. And so that's always been a part. That's probably why I wrote my dissertation on practices of what Presbyterians call social witness, or like political advocacy. And so that is a part of why Presbyterians would even seek to work for environmental justice, for just environmental policy. But on a deeper level, on a theological level, Calvin also understood the world and creation as God's theater of glory. And so we are participants in that theater, and the audience is God. And so we all are acting together and thinking about how we participate in the unfolding drama of God's creation. And so that's a really meaningful claim for me. Calvin also really trusted that God's will and person was revealed in nature. And that is an important thing to remember, because sometimes we sort of focus on the Reformed tradition's principle of sola scriptura, that God is, that Scripture is really the path or the place where we see the revelation of God. But Calvin also understood nature as revealing of God. So reading the sacred text in Scripture and reading the sacred text of nature kind of go hand in hand in our tradition.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way to put theater of creation. It's quite a nice phrase to have that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I like it. But of course, you know, Reformed Christians always are at risk of being too cognitively oriented, being too analytically oriented. That's also in our DNA. And so I think that poems like Mary Oliver and the invitation to pay attention, that sort of is a little bit of a corrective for our tradition.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll just ask, going off of that, like the theater part, the drama of it all. It's quite unique pieces of that drama playing out now in the natural world. And so for people and for congregations who maybe orient that way, or at least have some deep appreciation for creation and are trying to figure out how to engage their beliefs about God and creation, but in the midst of sort of COVID-19 and what that means, being isolated and apart from their congregation, but also trying to wrestle sort of with this drama of creation. Like, how do those ideas intersect?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think that, the other piece of the Reformed DNA that I didn't mention, because it's probably one of the least popular aspects of it, is the doctrine of predestination, in which sort of has sometimes been interpreted in history as God has foreordained everything that's happening. So some of the really bad theology that you have heard, like God has a plan. We just don't understand God's plan.
Yes.
It's a terrible thing to say to someone who's grieving. And I think that at the moment we're all grieving what's happening in our world. So that is a little bit of a unfortunate outworking of Reformed theology. And for me, I was helped to read another theologian, Jürgen Moltmann, who has written in his book, God and Creation, that the God who creates also is the God who is kind of luring us into an alternative future, a future of hope. And that part, at least, is somewhat unpredictable. And so for me, within the Christian tradition, I think that's a really important piece of how we understand God to be acting in the world. It's not just what God already has done or even is doing in the present, but also what God is doing and what God's creative and loving power is doing in the future. And that remains unknown. It remains something of a mystery. And I talk about this a little bit in the Inhabitants book, that the fact that God's work remains something of a mystery to us is an invitation to seek to know it better and to understand it better. A horizon that actually is never actually reached, but that we're always trying to know more about what God is doing and what God will do in the world. That was kind of a rambling answer.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Well, that helps move into, I want to talk a little bit about some of your work, I guess, particularly. You do a lot about place-based theological education and ecological education. And so I guess this sort of weaves into that. I guess what sticks out for you about the intersection of very place-based theology and education, and how does that work, or how does it intersect with shelter in place and restrictions on movement and restrictions on community, and what themes sort of come out at that intersection?
Well, yeah. That's a really challenging question, and certainly when I first started writing about place-based education generally, and particularly about theological education as place-based, I wasn't imagining a context in which most of our learning would be happening remotely, where we'd be in
Yeah,
this
right.
place.
This is the closest that we get.
Yeah. And so it's in some ways challenging some things that I've written before about how important it is the place where learning is happening. On the other hand, something I was already learning, one of the things I do at Candler is I direct our Doctor of Ministry program, and that is a mostly distance education program. It's about 90% online. And one of the things that I've discovered in getting to know those students and really sort of living in our curriculum is that learning is happening in the places where they are. So a Doctor of Ministry student or a remote student's context of learning is the place where they are, their congregation, their town, their bioregional ecosystem, their bioregion. And so that is there's all kinds of noise now. There's a train, there's people working.
It's perfect. That's the drama of creation, right?
This is my place. This is the place where I'm learning at the moment. So it has convinced me that place-based learning can't be about one place where learners come together to gather, but it has to be about multiple places, place as multiple. Mm-hmm. And so each time I meet with a Doctor of Ministry class in a Zoom setting like this, there might be 15 of them, there might be 30 of them, and they represent 30 different places, and they're bringing those places with them into this virtual place. That's one thing that I've sort of discovered. Yeah. The other thing is that I think that sometimes place-based education has been romanticized a little bit, such that the only thing that counts as a place is some sort of rural ideal. If you live in a city, in an apartment, if you live in a place without a lot of green space, then that's almost like no place, which of course is not true. So I've been helped by some language around a critical pedagogy of place, which tries to bring together the best parts of critical pedagogy, the raising of questions, the nurturing of critical consciousness, together with attention to place. So that all of us can practice attention to place in the places where we are. And one thing that Shelter in Place has done is it has pretty radically narrowed the range of what counts as our place. And so in some municipalities, the rule has been you may be outside within a mile of your home in the stricter shelter in place orders. Right. Most of those are in other countries, but so you can be within 1 mile of your home. Well, that really narrows the place that you're trying to get to know. And so as I walk the dogs in these same little routes around our neighborhood, we notice new plants, we notice new animals, small changes in our environment. Now I'll just close with this like really small illustration. I was walking my dog and we found like one little plot of fiddlehead ferns in my neighbor's yard that I hadn't noticed before. You know, they're so tiny when they're coming out of the ground and just, you know, all spindled up. But because we're walking the same route, I'm looking at the same spots every day, I notice these changes, and that is something that's important.
Yeah. So you've talked a lot about sort of the reflecting on the places that you're confined to, but surely, you know, as we can observe, there's all these justice questions that emerge when people are asked to be confined, and either because of the ways in which they must live their lives to survive can't be confined, or for individuals, especially in large cities, who are experiencing homelessness, who don't have a place to confine to. What are some of your reflections on that too, sort of the other side of the coin?
Yeah. Well, really, I'd like to hear your reflections on that question, because I know that's something that you've thought.
Yeah. Well, I mean, It does. I mean, it sort of falls into the same thing that you said, which is there's sort of a romanticized idea of place and the
Yeah.
idea that everyone has a place, what
Hmm.
that means, um, and believing that, sort of holding the belief that everyone should have access to safe places where they can experience, um, the holy, I guess, but also maybe have access to a place and also have lessened burdens so that they might have access to the creativity it requires to do some of that.
Right.
And it's not clear, it's clear that some of us have that capacity now, but we also then have these systems that almost ensure that not everyone can do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it certainly challenges what we think about as home. A lot of eco theology sort of turns on that language of home.
Mm.
And I mean, in some ways, I like it, right? Like it's an inviting and multivalent term. Like a lot of things can be home. But on the other hand, home can be elusive if you're experiencing homelessness. It can be dangerous if you're in an abusive situation.
Right.
Um, and so I think we're always working against that romanticization of these kinds of concepts as really crucial work for people of faith and conscience who are concerned about justice. Um, However, I also think it's important to say that all of us, humans and the more than human world, are inhabitants um, of an ecosystem. And that we share that habitat together um, means that for some of us, it's incumbent to work for the shoring up of home or safety or security for those who find it difficult to find. And for others of us, it's a affirmation of the dignity of all of us as inhabitants. And so I think that the term is more complicated than I think we often hear it. The idea
Sure.
of the earth as home. Um, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Um, I guess I'll ask something a bit more particular about COVID-19 and responses, which you already have talked a little bit about. But do you think, I guess, in part, the outbreak of COVID-19 and perhaps the way that, so there's one question which is about the way that governmental institutions respond, but also congregations, educational institutions,
Mhm.
communities, um, the ways in which that crisis emerged and the way that we have handled it and been forced to handle it in all those different ways. How should it and should it change the way that we think about environment? Um, how should it inform the way that we think about God and act with the
Mhm.
environment? And those may be in separate buckets, each of
Yeah.
those.
Yeah. We received a couple of days ago a newsletter from a church in our neighborhood that on the back page had um, the Exodus plagues.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, that's one theological interpretation.
Sure, you could do
God is
that, I
looking
guess.
at that. And now we have murder hornets. So I guess, it's um, I'm really making light of something that is really difficult, but that we are experiencing something that, if nothing else, has shown our global interdependence. It has shown that to us in sharp relief, and it has shown how a failure or a pretension that we are somehow immune to global challenges is false.
Yeah.
And so I think that the climate crisis is not that unlike this pandemic in that way, in that we sort of think that with enough privilege and technology, we are immune to some of the challenges that more economically resource poor um, peoples and states, we might think that they're more vulnerable to it
Sure.
in some way. And certainly they experience the effects sooner than we do. And just like in the pandemic, they also will experience the ravages of a public health crisis like this in ways that are deeper and more profound than some others of us will. But even given that, there is no escaping the interdependent nature of life on this planet. And for me, that's a really key learning. I don't know enough about the science, and you probably know more, Cody, about the relationship between climate change and the emergence of public health crises like this. But yeah, maybe you have something to say about that.
Well, I try not to play scientist if I don't have to.
Right. Yeah.
But I think what you're saying does have there's an interesting thread of, it sort of forces us to buck a bit of the Western notions of individuality, or even the idea that like you just have a community that you can invest in, or an institution that you can be a part of, and that somehow that institution can be strong enough or independent enough to not have to worry about what's going on in all these other places.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
The other thing I will say that I think this time is showing us, and it relates all the way back to the Mary Oliver poem, is that it really is an opportunity for some of us to reevaluate our priorities. And one of the things I work on a lot is the David Orr's concept of slow knowledge.
Yeah.
And he talked about fast knowledge as the kind of scientific development that turns on technology, and it's sort of like the fastest solution we can find. The faster we can find a solution to whatever challenge it is that we're facing, the better. And so we put our best technical minds on it, and then we deal with the fallout later. And certainly in this moment, we really need that kind of knowledge to identify possible cures and treatments and a vaccine for this deadly virus. So along with David Orr, I don't want to demonize that kind of knowledge, but he says there's also another kind of knowledge that's really important, and it kind of correlates to what we call in a lot of our religious traditions wisdom. And that's the kind of knowledge that you accumulate sounds really acquisitive. It's not like that. It's the kind of knowledge that you cultivate by having an ongoing, slow relationship, allowing a place or a context or a practice to teach and form you. And certainly the slowdown that we're experiencing during this pandemic is an opportunity to let that slow knowledge be formed in us.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, I want to talk about food too. Okay. I don't want to get out of this without talking about food because you have a lot of work on food. And I think that we are in a weird system where we're always sort of teetering on some sort of economic or agricultural collapse. Maybe would be maybe too strong of a word, but maybe not. And all these themes about essential workers now. You have explored systems of agriculture in the U.S. a ton, and especially their injustices before this and the injustices that it perpetuates. And so I guess, could you elaborate on some of that, but in particular, how those ideas maybe intersected with the lead up and perpetuation of systems that would cause a crisis like this to be maybe perhaps worse? And now that the food system is crucial, and we know that there are essential workers who are still not getting paid and are now experiencing an even greater risk of physical and health harm. I'm just curious how those things intersect with the work that you've already done, how you're thinking about that, how that intersects with food justice, and what does that mean for us after this? What do we have to get right after this?
Yeah, a lot. It intersects a lot.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wrote about in Good Food was the vulnerability of workers, laborers in our food system. And I was thinking especially about agricultural workers. And that is still the case. I think in the United States, I'm not sure what the number is now, but when I wrote the food book, we were down to about 5 major corporations that process meat in the United States. And at the time, there was a lot of concern about food safety. So if there were an outbreak of some sort of contagion in meat products, for example, that could affect 20% of the food supply if it happened in just one processing facility. And now we're also seeing the public health risks of these facilities. Not that it's the first time we've seen public health risks.
Sure.
There's a whole book on it. But certainly we're seeing that U.S. dependence on inexpensive meat products is literally costing the lives of persons who work in those facilities. Because in order to produce meat for that low of a cost, corners have to be cut in terms of treatment of animals and treatment of laborers. And so that's one place where I see the injustices of our food system really amplifying some of the effects of this pandemic. Yeah. Another place, and something I wrote less about in the food book, has to do with distribution. I mean, that's sort of one part of distribution, the processing plants, but there's also the very localized distribution. And so, as I'm sure many of you know, there have been strikes by Amazon workers, Whole Foods workers, Instacart workers. So Instacart has seen an explosion in business during this pandemic, and those could be very good short-term jobs for people who are laid off or furloughed. However, from what I understand, I don't know actually where the negotiations stand today, but the people who are drivers for Instacart and who do the shopping for Instacart have not seen an increase in what they make. And so one story I read on the Times was about, like, if you live in a big metro area like Atlanta, for example, you might be shopping in one store and traveling 10 miles to deliver it somewhere. It might be 2 hours of your time, and it might add up to a $7 fee that you get. And so it's far, far below minimum wage work, as are many of these jobs in what we are now calling the gig economy.
Yeah.
So, and they're taking on the risk. So I have a friend at Emory, her name's Allison Adams. When the Instacart strike first went down, she said, I've been feeling uncomfortable about this because really I'm asking someone else to take a risk, a health risk on my behalf. And so that is a category of people who are working in these jobs that do not make a lot of money, are not receiving enough personal protection equipment,
right,
and who are literally taking risks for us to have food to eat. And so that is something that we as people of faith and conscience need to wrestle with.
Yeah, I know you write a little bit about this in the Good Food book as well, but if you could briefly just say, what's a better way? What's the better system? I mean, there obviously is one. There are several options, I think, for that, but it's surely not what we have or what we had before this. And so as faith communities, I think, begin to grapple with what they can do and what that vision looks like. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah. So there's a kid out here on a scooter now, so let me know if it's out.
That's good.
He's taking a break from his schoolwork. I think that Claire Butterfield, who was the founder of the Illinois Interfaith Power and Light organization called Faith in Place, said that the way to solve our problems with our food system is not to make food cheaper, but to pay everyone enough so that they can afford to pay what it costs to grow a carrot in a way that is gentle on the land and also supportive of people who are doing the agricultural work. And I think for me, that's a really good principle. And so where I'm able, and I'm not able to do it always because food is expensive, but where we were able to support local farmers, local producers, paying what it actually costs to grow food. So many things that we buy in the supermarket actually we're paying less than what it costs to produce.
Right.
And so that's dependent on a whole system of government insurance and subsidies and so on that that really obscure from us the actual cost, the human cost and the financial cost of food. Yeah. And so knowing more about that, I think is one step. The second piece is not, and I think this is also what Claire Butterfield said, is not impoverishing people who work in agriculture. So in the process of acquiring our cheap food. So the food cost, there's the question of food cost on the consumer side, but then there's also the question of, I mean, people who work in agriculture also are consumers. And so the less they are able to make, if they don't have a living wage, then they too are confronted with nutritional and other economic disparities.
Yeah, we talk a lot at GIPL, or I talk in congregations a lot, that it's actually to ethically purchase, whether that is to move away from styrofoam and to use real dishes, or whether it's to move to composting, or whether it's to pay more for the food, is that it turns out that the most ethical, moral thing to do isn't the cheapest. Mm-hmm. That it actually takes some doing, and that it is it affects our moral fabric to do that. It's a system built that makes it difficult and harder to make ethical choices, even when it comes to eating.
Yeah,
which is something that we have to do.
Yeah, I hear myself saying those things, and I'm like, well, that really is. It sounds like a very privileged conversation, but it's fundamentally about justice, because so long as we're not willing to pay what it actually costs, then people will be suffering in right. all aspects of the food system. So we think about farmers, but there's also just untold numbers of laborers in processing and distribution in grocery stores and food service industry, all of whom are oppressed by our obsession with cheap food.
Right. And I don't think it's not enough to maybe take what I would think would be a more privileged angle to say, like, just buy organic food. Right. It's not that. It's actually, we have to transform a food system that perpetuates injustice and kills people for cheap. And that's what they're doing right now. So I think, and incorporating that justice piece. I have a couple more questions that I'm going to try to get through quickly, but I wanted to touch on, this is a bit outside the realm of food per se, but I think it's particular to shelter in place and people being separated, because in good food, you talk about food and meals as sort of a holy thing that coming to, there's all sorts of metaphors throughout traditions about gathering at tables, obviously. And so I'm just curious, how do you think that changes the importance of meals and being separate and not being able to gather around tables in this time? There is no world in which we get to gather around tables now. A lot of people, though they might have their families home, can't meet with other people. And then for people like myself, are alone. And so what does that mean for communal meals? In particular, maybe some of those metaphors that we draw on for community.
Yeah. This is something I'm struggling with. Our congregation, like a lot of your religious communities, has moved our worship online. And yesterday or Sunday was a communion Sunday, and we were instructed to gather the elements for communion and celebrate it around our tables. Right. And I have not been able to do that. Not because I don't have, some kind of bread and some kind of cup, but because I'm feeling profoundly the fact that we are not together And at least at the moment, it's not enough for me to have a memorial meal where
Yeah.
I remember what it's like to gather together. And so I guess the first thing I would say is that, and maybe this is just me, putting my baggage out there, but that I think it's okay to lament
Mm.
the absence of these meals and to feel it profoundly and to not rush to fix that feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Um,
good.
because I think that, yeah, I mean, I gather with one group of very precious friends once a week, and we're having a drink together. And a couple of us, one person is a single parent who lives with his mom and his daughter. Another person lives alone. Third person lives with her mom, and I live with my spouse and our kids. And but each of us are experiencing this differently and are missing different modes of gathering around a table, whether it be an explicitly religious table or just a community table.
Yeah.
And so I think that, so anyway, we have a little drink together, but I mean, it's,
Yeah. Lament is good, I think.
yeah.
That
I
makes
mean, I
sense.
think lament and memory. I think, at least for me, the memory of being in an embodied relationship with these people is sustaining me in this virtual space. But I hope that it won't always be a memory. I hope that there will be, back to Moltmann, that there will be
Right.
some sort of future gathering, and I count on that reality. But yeah, I think that's where I am with it.
Yeah. Um, almost finally. I wanted to give you a chance to talk a bit about Inhabitants,
Mm-hmm.
your newest book, and
Yeah, my
some of the
publisher would appreciate that probably.
yeah, some of the themes where that is. Where can people pick it up?
Yeah.
And how some of those ideas. I mean, you've talked a bit about how they layer onto COVID in the previous discussion, so
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to dive too deep into that. But yeah, give people a sense about what that's about, why you wrote it, and what it offers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the book makes a pretty, well, as radical as any Presbyterian claim can be, a pretty radical claim, and that is that what if the paradigmatic human vocation is to be good inhabitants of this planet? And from a Christian perspective, we think about this planet as God's creation, as the theater for God's glory, the place in which God's love and creativity is at work always before us, with us, and in front of us. And I draw on just a pretty simple word study of the term ecology, which is a knowledge of an oikos, which is a household. So we're back to that home image. But thinking about our ecosystem as a household and what kind of an inhabitant are we? We are inhabitants. The reality might be that some of us are better inhabitants than others.
Yeah.
But my subfield in practical theology is religious education. And the basic premise of religious education is that we always are learners. There's not like a moment at which we've arrived and we can say, oh, now I'm, fully Christian or, fully whatever. And I think that's a really important principle to hold in our hearts as we think about how we learn how to be good inhabitants of God's creation. And so we will never have fully arrived, but there's always new depths, new connections, new creative energy that can inspire us.
Yeah.
And also, finally, the book attends to not only how we relate to the more than human world, but also how we relate to other human beings. And so there's still because this is where my passion for this topic emerged, there's still a strong emphasis on how we think about social justice as it relates to how we inhabit this planet. And so, and then I conclude the book with some work on place and embodied and emotional vulnerability as key components of this kind of work. And I talk about some communities that really embody that work.
Great.
Yeah, and it's available from Baylor University Press, as is Good Food.
There it is. And we'll include a link to that on when this is pushed out on our website.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll send you a link to the Baylor page,
yeah.
which with the books.
Thank you for being here and sitting in on this conversation, being our first guest on Coffee and Something Stronger.
Well, I tried to set the bar real low, so it's going to go up from here.
All right, I want to ask you two questions that I'm going to end every one of these talks with, which is, what are you missing the most in this COVID-19 world? And you talked a little bit about lament, and maybe that's the same. Mm-hmm. And then what are you clinging to that gives you hope in these days?
Yeah. I think what I'm missing the most, yeah, it is gathering. And where I'm feeling it most profoundly right now is with our students at Candler School of Theology who will graduate on Saturday. And yeah, I miss those students a lot. I miss the energy that we feel when we're in a room together. Yeah, and the learning community that we established. But I also remember it. And so, yeah, that lament and memory is very strong for me right now. And then I guess what gives me hope, is that what you asked?
Yes. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Yeah, I mean, I think just watching things grow in the yard. I think seeing our communities coming together, supporting each other, knowing that there is a future that we don't know yet, but that gives me great hope. If I can just plug like one other, I mean, everybody can support GIPL, but if I can plug one other organization, one that I think is really doing important work is called the Giving Kitchen, which is an Atlanta-based nonprofit, but it is now supporting food service workers throughout Georgia, not just in response to COVID-19, but in response to any kind of like health issue or life disruption challenge that people who work often without benefits because they don't work full time, or who are otherwise are vulnerable, extremely vulnerable to situations like the one we're in right now. I think they're doing really important work, and I'm really grateful for seeing organizations like that who are looking out for each other. And the way in which we're able to look out for each other, I think, is probably the thing that makes my heart most glad.
Yeah.
Season we're in.
Well, thank you for being here, everyone. Next week, same time, same place, we'll be doing an interview with Reverend Hunt Priest, who is the priest at St. Peter's Episcopal in Savannah, Georgia, to talk about specifically how all of these intersections affect people on the coast and parish priests. I will end with just an excerpt from Good Food, actually, and you talking a bit about what the importance of people of faith kind of working to disrupt these systems. You say, in their little moves against destructiveness, people of faith discover and reveal God's presence in the everyday. They express their wonder in response to God's provision and earth's beauty, but they also stand as a witness to the sin and brokenness that characterize the food system, and that make truly good food a near impossibility. Finally, they fortify the bonds of interdependence that join people together in communities, in Christ's body, the church, and in human relationships with God's body, the earth. In these seemingly small things, they are visionaries. And my hope and prayer is that all of us can be visionaries in this way.
So you are, Cody.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in.